South Africa's economy continues to nosedive. Stats SA announced today that the economy shrunk by 3.2% in the first 3 months of this year. But the Institute for Economic Justice remains hopeful that the economy can be rejuvenated. The Institute is proposing government implement an aggressive fiscal stimulus and public investment programs. For more on this, I'm now joined via Skype from Cape Town by Neil Coleman, who is the co-director of the Institute for Economic Justice. Good evening, Neil. Thanks very much for your time. Going through your piece, one couldn't help but go back, over the years, whether you were a part of COSATU and other initiatives that involved NGOs and other grassroots-oriented organizations, you've been saying the same things over and over again, but it would seem like nobody is listening.
Well, Vuyo, I think there comes a point to be grand in a country's history where you've got to make a choice. You've got to say, the policies that we've stuck to for 25 years, have they worked? And I think people are reaching the realization now that we cannot keep doing the same things and hoping to get different results. So I think the fact that myself and many, many others in civil society and even within government and some in business that we've spoken to have been raising for a long time now that the economic policies that are being followed are not having the desired effect. I think now, with the release of the GDP stats today, if nobody is able to see that, then they are clearly not wanting to look at the evidence that's all around them. We have a ongoing and deepening crisis. That's very, very clear. And the fact that we had the electricity, the blackouts, the problems with Eskom, etc., is only part of the explanation. There's been a steady process of deindustrialization, the hollowing out of important parts of our manufacturing sector. The cost of credit is simply too much for small businesses to afford in the country. The policies of austerity, of cutting back on state spending, have massively hit the issues of public investment. We know that private investors are not investing, and we're hoping that somehow foreign investors will rescue us from the situation. But the reality is, nowhere in the world have foreign investors led and domestic investors followed. It's always been the other way around. So we have to build confidence in our own economy, and the only way to do that is to provide a real economic stimulus, but also to have plans in place to progressively transform the structure of our economy, because we remain a commodity-dependent economy.
But why do you believe government in particular continues to stick to the things that you are saying don't and have never worked? I attended a session shortly after the elections where the president was addressing a whole group of investors. People were told are responsible for something like 400 billion in assets. They seemed to approve of virtually everything he said. Every word he uttered, they seemed to approve of.
I think that's the problem, Vuyo, when you operate in an echo chamber. You only hear the same views from the same people, and this was our objection when the Minister of Finance convened the colloquium that he convened last year, because he was getting the advice from the usual suspects. And you know, even the most conservative international institutions, and I referred to this in my Daily Maverick article today, like the IMF, have now for some years since the global financial crisis accepted that they were wrong on the issue of capital controls, that they're wrong on the issue of inflation targeting, that they're wrong on the issue of trade unions and labor market, and so on. So there is this shift that's taken place internationally, including a recognition that austerity policies in Europe were absolutely disastrous. But it seems like our Treasury and key elements of government, I'm not saying the entire government and the entire ANC, but they're very powerful elements within government and within the ruling party that seem to cling on to these outdated ideas, and in part because they're terrified of the rating agencies, they're terrified of the global financial institutions, etc. And it's time that we stopped looking to these institutions and agencies for direction. It's time we took responsibility and sovereignty for our own economic direction. You know, ordinary people who are suffering or unemployed, etc., in the townships, to be honest, couldn't give a damn what the ratings agencies say. What they want are jobs. They want an improvement in their lives. And, kowtowing to these agencies simply isn't working. I'm not saying, and we are not saying as the Institute, that we must be reckless, that we must embark on wild spending sprees, etc., But what the international experience shows since the global financial crisis in particular is that states that have taken responsibility to implement large-scale public investment programs, to implement a degree of, for example, capital controls, to do all these things that aim to protect their population and to build and boost their economy. Those are the states that have managed to weather the global financial crisis. The others that have followed the advice of deregulation, liberalization, etc., like we have fared the worst. That's very, very clear.
Well, actually, I'm looking at some of the words that were used there about those investors who were asked what they believe were the problems or challenges facing the country today. And they mentioned policy uncertainty. They spoke about the regulatory framework. And what's interesting is that they were also, they spoke to the president about the role of the South African Reserve Bank. And I'm going to quote here from what the president said. He said, and I quote, "I'm pleased with an independent South African Reserve Bank and how it's kept inflation in check." And the reason I'm bringing the South African Reserve Bank into this conversation is because on the back of today's numbers, a lot of people are asking, what then is the Reserve Bank going to do? What do you think it should do?
Well, the Reserve Bank, many, many months and years ago, after the global financial crisis, should have embarked on a bold strategy of cutting interest rates, like has been done by the Federal Reserve in the US, like has been done by a number of other reserve banks internationally. The problem is that the policy stance of Treasury and the Reserve Bank is that in order to attract speculative inflows, in other words, through the maintenance of high interest rates, to attract short-term inflows into the country, they have to maintain this high interest rate policy. And that is extremely short-sighted. And many commentators have pointed out that the problems of inflation in South Africa cannot be dealt with through the blunt instruments of interest rates. What you do by raising interest rates is that you stifle economic activity. And the other important point to acknowledge is that the government's official policy is that where the economy is contracting like it is now and like it has been for a number of years, you need to introduce what's called a counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy. And what that means is that when the economy is stagnating, you stimulate it by loosening up monetary policy and fiscal policy. But we're doing the opposite. We're actually tightening up monetary policy, we're tightening up fiscal policy, large-scale cutbacks. And as a result, public investment has suffered. As a result, the cost of capital is too expensive for small business and the manufacturers, etc., to invest in the productive sector, which is what we need. That is what we urgently and critically need.
And I'm asking this, of course, on a day the ANC just came out of its NEC Lekgotla, and in its statement says the ANC NEC Lekgotla agreed to expand the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank beyond price stability to include growth and employment. It also directed the ANC government to consider constituting a task team to explore quantity easing measures to address intergovernmental debts to make funds available for developmental purposes.
That's great news, Voyo. The question is now, will the ANC and will the government have the courage of their convictions to implement this? Because this is what should have been done many, many years ago. The problem has been historically, as you know, a schizophrenia between the policies of the ANC and the alliance on the one side and the policies of government on the other. But this is very welcome news, and certainly we hope that will be implemented. And if you look at the experiences of a number of other countries where governments have used these levers to either cut interest rates or to expand the fiscus, they have impacts over the relatively short term. And that's what we argue in our article today, is that you can combine that with other measures to protect the most vulnerable in society while you are beginning to transform the sectors of the economy which take a longer period of time. But through these fiscal and monetary policy measures, you actually enable greater investment in society, and that is very welcome.
Neil Coleman, that's where we're going to leave it for this evening. Thanks very much for your time and insights. He is a co-director of the Institute for Economic Justice.